Have you ever noticed that sometimes you end up liking something and you can't really explain why? Maybe it's a brand, maybe it's a creator, maybe it's a product, or maybe it's even a person. You don't necessarily know the moment or remember the moment you decided to like them. You just know that over time, they started to feel familiar. And because they felt familiar, they started to feel trustworthy. There's actually a psychological principle for this. It's called the mere exposure effect. And I think it's one of the most important concepts in all of marketing. Let me tell you why. The mere exposure effect is the idea that people tend to develop a preference for things simply because they're familiar with them, not because they are objectively better, and not because they spent hours analyzing them either, or because they compared every option even. And it's not even because they've seen them before. And trust me, once you start noticing this effect, you'll see it everywhere. Think about the last time you heard a new song. The first time, maybe you weren't so sure about it. The second time, still not convinced, probably. Then a few weeks later, you're catching yourself singing it in the shower. What changed? The song definitely didn't. You changed. You did. The repeated exposure changed your relationship with it. And I think this explains a lot about how people misunderstand marketing. Because most marketers are obsessed with making the perfect piece of content. It could be that they're obsessed over the perfect ad or campaign, or even something as simple as the perfect post. But customers don't usually build trust through one perfect interaction. They build trust through repeated interactions. This reminds me of something I've talked about before. Your best friend probably isn't your best friend because of one incredible moment. They're your best friend because of 100 small moments, 100 conversations, 100 experiences over time. And that's how trust was built. It probably wasn't instantly. More likely, it was gradual. And brands, they work the same way. One of the biggest mistakes marketers make is believing that every piece of content has to be extraordinary. Like every post has to go viral, or every campaign has to just be like this absolute home run. But that's usually not how trust works. Most of the time, people are simply getting familiar with you. They're learning who you are. They're learning what you stand for. They're learning what to expect. And every time you show up consistently, you make another small deposit into that trust account. And something I find really interesting is familiarity isn't exactly the same thing as trust. We've all seen brands we're familiar with that we don't trust. But familiarity is often the first step. It's hard to trust something you've never encountered. It's hard to buy from a company you've never heard of. It's hard to believe someone you've never seen before. But familiarity reduces uncertainty. And reducing uncertainty is one of the primary jobs of marketing. Think about what happens when you're shopping for something online. You have two options. One company that you've seen 10 times, the other company you've never even heard of. All else being completely equal, which one feels safer? usually the familiar one. Not because you know it's better, because it feels lower risk. That is the mere exposure effect at work. And this is why I think so much marketing advice gets it wrong. You'll hear people say things like, you need to go viral, or you need a breakthrough campaign. And sure, those things can help and they're fantastic when they work. But most successful brands weren't built through a single moment. They were built through repeated exposure, repeated experiences, and repeated proof over and over again. Which is also why consistencies matter so much. Not because the algorithm likes consistency, because people like consistency. People trust what they understand, and they understand what they see repeatedly. Now, this doesn't mean you should just flood the internet with junk. That's where people misunderstand this idea. Exposure alone isn't enough. Bad experiences repeated are still bad experiences. You still have to provide value. You still have to deliver on your promises. You still have to create things worth paying attention to. But if you're doing those things, repetition becomes incredibly and exponentially more powerful. And this is probably one of the big reasons so many marketers quit too early. They post for a month, maybe 2. Then they stop because they don't see that immediate results. But they forgot that most people are just beginning to recognize them. Most people aren't ready to buy the first time they see you. They're still figuring out who you are and what you stand for, whether they should trust you. And that takes time. The brands that win understand this. The creators that win understand this. They aren't trying to create that one perfect moment. They're trying to create thousands of small moments. Because eventually, those moments compound. And that's when something interesting happens. People stop seeing you as unfamiliar. They stop seeing you as risky. And they start seeing you as the obvious choice. Not necessarily because you're better, although you should always strive for that, but because you are familiar. And whether you like it or not, familiarity has a powerful influence on human behavior. That's the mere exposure effect. And if you understand it, you stop obsessing over perfection. And you start focusing on consistency. Because trust usually isn't built in a moment. It's built through repeated exposure. I hope you liked this video. This topic is very interesting and near and dear to my heart. I believe it to my core. I've seen it. I hope you'll subscribe, leave a comment, all the things, and I'll see you next week.